Good morning. I'm Rabbi Sue Shankman. It gives me great pride to welcome you to Washington Hebrew Congregation's Amram Scholar Series. The Amram Scholar Series offers a stimulating program of free lectures throughout the year in which world-renowned speakers, authors, scholars, political leaders, policy analysts, and theologians share their perspectives on timely issues or their research into history. The program traces its beginnings to the fall of 1954 when Washington Hebrew moved into our Macomb Street home. And that fall, participating in a nationwide celebration that marked the 300th anniversary of Jewish settlement in the United States, Washington Hebrew launched what would become this widely recognized Sunday morning lecture program. And our past chair for a number of years, Leslie Maitland, is here today and has ensured that these lectures are of a not just a timely nature, but on an intellectual level that will be stimulating and engaging, and we appreciate all her efforts over the years. Today's lecture is also in partnership with the Jewish Book Council, so we encourage you at the close of the program today to join us in the atrium and to purchase a book and have it signed, a great Hanukkah present, and that will follow this morning's program. Today's Amram lecture is also sponsored by the Leo and Elizabeth Goodman Public Issues Fund. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. Leo and Elizabeth Goodman were both activists throughout their lives, both professionally and in their personal lives. Both natives of the Boston area, they met when they served as fellow volunteer adult leaders of the Boy and Girl Scout troops, respectively, at Boston's Settlement House. Leo was an Eagle Scout. Elizabeth was pursuing her master's degrees in social work at Simmons College at the time. They married the day after Elizabeth was awarded her master's degree, moved to Washington, D.C. to join Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Leo spent his career as a union lobbyist advocating for fair housing and nuclear safety, while Elizabeth spent hers developing and heading programs for children with special needs as principal of D.C.'s Sharp Health School and visiting instruction corps, and later in the Office for Exceptional Children at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. On the personal level, they were both active in civil rights. They both attended Marian Anderson's concert in 1939 at the Lincoln Memorial after she was barred from performing at the DAR Constitution Hall. They were back at the Lincoln Memorial for the 1963 March on Washington, where they heard Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. During retirement years, Leo served on Washington Hebrew's Social Action Committee and was particularly active helping Iranian Jewish immigrants after the Iranian Revolution led to a takeover by religious extremists. They had an inspirational effect on their children and grandchildren. Many of us here know Lois and also David Ontel, her husband, and Joan Churchill, who is not physically with us, but is joining us on the live stream due to COVID exposure. We thank her for that, for joining us, along with all others who are joining us on the live stream. We know Lois and Joan well for their contributions, particularly through our Community Issues Social Action Committee and the Empty Nesters Inside the Issues, among other programs. And they clearly came to this work honestly. Lois was encouraged at age 14 to join sit-ins at Glen Echo and Woolworths. Joan pursued a career as an immigration lawyer and judge, and we are thrilled that Maury, a 1966 WHC confirmand, is able to join us from Chicago. And I was going to say, I believe this is the first time all three siblings were able to be here for the lecture, but of course now we have Joan on the live stream, but she's here with us and for this annual Goodman lecture.
We have Maury.
Yes, that's right. I just said Maury is here with us as well. And following Leo and Elizabeth's deaths 38 years ago, WHC established the Leo and Elizabeth Goodman Public Issues Fund, which co-sponsors lectures and forums in their memory. And we're delighted that their family has chosen to sponsor today's lecture. The Goodman grandchildren are active in serving their respective communities as well. Is Jacqueline here too? But I see Lily, who's here with us. They both became bat mitzvah and were confirmed here at WHC. And Sarah, nice to see you. It's been a while. And their grandmother, Elizabeth Goodman, taught in the WHC Sunday School for over 18 years. Her service is recognized on the plaque that hangs in our religious schools at both the Bindeman Center and here at Macomb Street. And following in their grandmother's footsteps, Lily served as a WHC religious school teacher for several years, and I believe was also my daughter Isabel's camp counselor, third grade teacher. There we go. And Jackie served as a religious school aide following her confirmation. I want to offer a special thank you to Eliza Prince, our Director of Development, for working with the Goodman family to select the speaker for this year's Goodman Lecture. Since both Joan and Lois chose legal careers, Joan serving as a judge for much of her career, given that their parents were part of the liberal establishment, today's topic was a most appropriate one for the Goodman Fund to co-sponsor. It actually was the quickest decision, I believe, in selecting a lecture. On that note, I am delighted to welcome and introduce our speaker today, Professor Brad Snyder, who will speak about his biography of Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, Democratic Justice. A Georgetown University law professor and Guggenheim Fellow, Brad Snyder teaches constitutional law, sports law, and 20th century American legal history, and has written books and law review articles about the history of the Supreme Court. His book, Democratic Justice, Felix Frankfurter, the Supreme Court, and the Making of the Liberal Establishment, is the first comprehensive biography of the Harvard Law School professor, New Deal power broker, and Supreme Court justice. Prior to teaching law, Professor Snyder worked as, Brad, as he told me to make sure to call him, as an associate at Williams & Connolly LLP, and wrote 2 critically acclaimed books about baseball, including A Well-Paid Slave, Curt Flood's Fight for Free Agency in Professional Sports. A graduate of Duke University and Yale Law School, he clerked for the Honorable Dorothy W. Nelson on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. For more information, you can go to his website, bradsnyderauthor.com. You can follow him on, well, are you still on Twitter? At @BradSnyderProf. But perhaps most importantly, Brad became a bar mitzvah and was confirmed here at Washington Hebrew Congregation. His picture is on the wall. We can direct you to the general area, which one we were looking earlier. And Rabbi Lustig had the honor of officiating at his and Shelby's wedding a few years back. And also, importantly, his mom, Linda Snyder, joins us, as well as his aunt, Nancy Van Grack, and we're so happy to have them back with us as well today, and to welcome Brad home. And so, with no further ado, I give you Brad Snyder. You're welcome.
Well, thank you so much. This really feels like my second bar mitzvah doing this. Rabbi Schenkman promised me there would be no Torah portion, so I think I'm okay.
I didn't say anything about Haftarah.
Yeah, you did not say anything about Haftarah, but this is a huge honor for me to be back at this synagogue. I went to the Bindeman Center for many years for Hebrew school. Yes, my picture's on the wall, 1988, front row, eyes closed, about 4 foot 10 inches tall. You can see for yourself, but it's a tremendous honor for me to be here and to give this talk today, and to have my mother here, and to have my aunt here, and to have my law school friends here is pretty amazing. And so thanks for everyone for coming. So I'm going to do 2 things during my talk. First of all, how many of you are lawyers in this room? Okay, so I've got about 60% normal people, 40% not normal people in the room. I just wanted to kind of judge my audience, but I'm going to do 2 things. One, I'm going to tell you about why Felix Frankfurter believed that judicial restraint was a liberal judicial philosophy, and why the Supreme Court was a sort of historically reactionary institution that liberals should avoid at all costs and try to change things through the democratic political process. The second thing I'm going to do is talk about Frankfurter's life as the third Jewish justice, and how his Jewish life, just his amazing Jewish immigrant story, and how his Jewish life influenced his career. So I'll try to do a little bit of both of those things. Frankfurter grew up in Austria until he was age 11. And one of the challenges I had in writing this book was trying to reconstruct his life in Austria, because for Frankfurter, his life really began when he came to America. But in Austria, his father was a very unsuccessful kind of door-to-door salesman, and for a time even moved the family to Budapest. But Frankfurter lived for a time while his father was both in Budapest and then in the United States before the entire family came over. He lived with his uncle Solomon. And Solomon Frankfurter was a librarian and a philologist at the University of Vienna. He was one of the most highly respected Jewish leaders in all of Austria, and he was a real mentor and intellectual idol for Felix. And I have a feeling that Felix became a professor because of his uncle Solomon. And I'll tell you more about his uncle Solomon later on. But as I said, he came to this country in 1894 at age 11. He had, that's the ship manifest, and there I've circled in yellow his name on the ship manifest there. He was in steerage with his siblings there, Otto and Leopold and Paul, and then his sister Ella and his mother Emma at the top. He had never heard a sentence of English or a word of English. He could not speak a word of English, and he credits his rapid rise in this country. This is someone, age 11, not a word of English. By 25, he was on a first-name basis with former President Theodore Roosevelt, and he advised almost every American president between Theodore Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, right? So I want to try to chart out how he got here, right? He credits a teacher, his very first teacher, at PS 35 in Lower Manhattan, a woman named Miss Hogan. And this was a school in not the Lower East Side, but above the Lower East Side in a German-American neighborhood where many of the students in the school spoke German as well as English. And Frankfurter's teacher threatened his fellow students with corporal punishment, which you could, of course, do in those days, if any of the students spoke to Felix in his native German. Well, they didn't, and Felix rapidly learned English to the point where he gave a speech at his elementary school graduation. Was one of 2 or 3 people to give a speech. The next big move for Frankfurter was going to CCNY. So for those of you who don't know about City College, it offered a free combined high school and college program for anyone in the city who essentially tested in to CCNY. And for American Jews who immigrated here, it was really an equalizer, right? It enabled people to have tremendous social mobility by graduating from college at 19 or 20 and then going on to graduate school or the professions with, in these days, which would be unheard of, 0 debt, right? And Frankfurter finished 3rd in his class at CCNY, and this is a picture of him on his debating society, Cleonia. There he is circled in yellow in the middle there, wearing a bow tie. And he goes on from CCNY, he works for a year in the New York City Tenement House Department, and then he decides, after a couple of fit and starts at other law schools, he tried out a few other law schools and decided they weren't very good, and someone who he worked with at the Tenement House Department suggested that he go to Harvard. Now, in those days, Harvard Law School was totally different than it is now. Practically anyone could go, but they flunked out about 1/3 of the class after the first year. And it was completely done by grades, and if your grades didn't meet the mark, you were out. So Frankfurter goes to Harvard Law School, and after his first year, he's first in his class. After his second year, he's first in his class, and after his 3rd year, he's first in his class. 2 things happened at Harvard. During his 2nd year at Harvard, the Supreme Court of the United States decides this case called Lochner versus New York, which just about anybody who went to law school would remember. It's a case about a maximum hour law for bakers that the Supreme Court struck down based on a theory that there is a liberty of contract in the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. The reason why this case is significant is because it enabled the court to strike down all of this pro-labor and pro-worker legislation, such as minimum wage laws and maximum hour laws, all based on this liberty of contract theory, even though the exact words liberty of contract aren't actually in the Constitution. So this was a big moment for him. The other big moment for him in law school, I think intellectually, is an article he read by a law professor who was dead by the time he got there, but whose name is James Bradley Thayer. And Thayer believed that the Supreme Court of the United States should not strike down a law unless it was unconstitutional beyond a reasonable doubt. And so he's sort of importing a sort of criminal jury standard into the Supreme Court's role in judging whether laws are constitutional or not, because Thayer believed that most of the change should come through the democratic political process. Well, Frankfurter really adopted Thayer's theory. He thought Thayer's article, written in 1893, was the most important article ever written about constitutional law. And whenever a new justice would come on the Supreme Court of the United States and be nominated and confirmed, Frankfurter would give him a copy of Thayer's article. As I said, Frankfurter graduates first in his class. At the end of his third year was when law students typically looked for jobs. They didn't look before at the end of their first year like they do now, and summer at a law firm, second summer, and then go to that firm after law school like those of us did. They waited till the spring of their third year to look for jobs, and none of the New York law firms would have him, because most of the New York law firms at the time excluded Jews. And Frankfurter went to each of these law firms for interviews with sealed cards, like 3x5 kind of cards, sealed. Recommendations from the dean of Harvard Law School, James Barr Ames. And one of the lawyers at one of these firms, out loud with Frankfurter right next to him, said, this is his handwriting. He didn't believe what was on the cards could actually be true. And what the cards said was that Frankfurter was the best student at Harvard Law School in the last 10 years. And so eventually one of these firms, a firm with about as funny name as Felix Frankfurter, and that's the Hornblower firm, decided to hire Felix. He lasts 2 months. After 2 months, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York calls him and says, I need to see you. Frankfurter had no idea what the call was about. Here's Frankfurter, lower left, graduating first in his class at Harvard. That's Frankfurter and his other Harvard Law Review members. And this is his fellow U.S. attorneys. Stimson calls him because Theodore Roosevelt has appointed Stimson the chief federal prosecutor for all of lower Manhattan, with the idea of busting trusts. In particular, the sugar monopoly there was evidence was engaged in all of this illegal activity, and he wanted Stimson to prosecute it. The problem was Stimson had never tried a case. He was not a litigator, and he didn't have a big budget. His budget was about $30,000. So his idea was to hire a bunch of young, recent Harvard Law School, Columbia Law School, and Yale Law School graduates who had been on the law review to be assistant U.S. attorneys, and that's why he called Frankfurter. So Frankfurter, after 2 months at a law firm, joins the prosecutor's office, and he spends the next 4 or 5 years there working on the sugar trust prosecutions with Stimson and other lawyers. This was huge because Stimson introduced him to Theodore Roosevelt. Stimson ran for governor of New York after leaving the prosecutor's office, and Frankfurter worked on his campaign with Theodore Roosevelt, and he became on a first-name basis with Theodore Roosevelt, talking with him about politics. Stimson did not win the governorship in New York. Instead, William Howard Taft made Stimson Secretary of War, and Stimson took Frankfurter along with him to Washington to be his right-hand man. And that's where Frankfurter's really at the House of Truth. This is the subject of my last book. When Frankfurter comes to Washington in 1911, he lives in a house in DuPont Circle, right behind Kramer Books on the north side. It still stands, 1727 19th Street. And he lived in it with a bunch of young lawyers in the Taft administration and some non-lawyers in the Taft administration, all of whom had one thing in common. They thought William Howard Taft was a terrible president. And they thought that the way to establish an industrial democracy in this country was to reinstall Theodore Roosevelt as president. Theodore Roosevelt had not served 2 full terms and was eligible to run for a third. And they also helped founded a magazine as an outlet for Theodore Roosevelt's ideas, and that magazine is The New Republic. And on the right, there is an invitation in 1914 to a dinner for the New Republic. And Frankfurter was one of the original incorporators of the New Republic, and he became a frequent contributor to the New Republic and basically their expert on all matters about the Supreme Court of the United States. While he's at the House of Truth, he befriends two legal luminaries in the country and has them over for regular dinners at this political salon. On the left is Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., and on the right is then lawyer Louis Brandeis. And by the way, I love the portrait of Brandeis that you have up in the front hall by Warhol. It's pretty amazing and caught my eye this morning. But they really become mentors of Frankfurters, surrogate father figures, if you will, of Frankfurters for the rest of his life. And you know, both of them believe in this liberal idea of judicial restraint. Both of them have adopted, in kind of different ways, this idea that the Supreme Court should keep its hands off of economic and social legislation and not strike it down unless it's unconstitutional beyond a reasonable doubt. At the House of Truth, at these parties and dinner parties, he meets his future wife, the student body president at Smith College, Marion Denman. She's not Jewish. They take a long time to get married because both of their families oppose this relationship. They take about 6 years from that time until they get married. In the fall of 1914, Frankfurter's called back to Harvard by the Harvard Law faculty. He's the first Jewish Harvard Law faculty member. You can see it's not a big faculty. It has, 10 people on there, and Frankfurter is the youngest by far, but when they called him, they said, to a man, we want Felix Frankfurter, right? There are no women at Harvard Law School at this time, right? There are no women law students at Harvard Law School at this time. It is all male and virtually all white. 1916 is a huge moment, both for Frankfurter and I think for the liberal movement and for American Jews. Woodrow Wilson in 1916 nominates Louis Brandeis to be the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. There is widespread opposition to that nomination and no one fighting for it. Brandeis waited the longest. I had to amend this in my last book. Waited the longest for a Senate Judiciary Committee of any Supreme Court judicial nominee until Merrick Garland, who never got one. This went on for months and months and months, and Frankfurter and Brandeis became even closer during this time period because Frankfurter and someone he lived with at the House of Truth, an up-and-coming writer named Walter Lippmann, were writing the editorials in the New Republic, championing Brandeis's confirmation and fighting the attacks against Brandeis. 51 of the kind of business leaders of Boston, the Boston Brahmin class, signed a letter opposing Brandeis's confirmation. 7 past members, the American Bar Association, including presidents of the ABA, opposed his nomination, including William Howard Taft, who was outraged by the nomination. But Frankfurter and Lippmann did something really interesting. They refused to make the fight about Brandeis's nomination about anti-Semitism, even though there was a huge undercurrent of anti-Semitism that was baked into the opposition to Brandeis as a nominee. They wanted to fight it on the merits, not as attacking his attackers as anti-Semites. Brandeis eventually gets confirmed. The only reason why he got confirmed is because President Woodrow Wilson basically strong-armed Southern Democrats into voting for him just as a matter of party loyalty, and he was basically confirmed on party lines. Only 3 Republicans voted to confirm Brandeis. But that was a huge deal for liberals because Brandeis really was closer in ideology to Frankfurter than Holmes was. Holmes didn't think any legislation would make a difference at all. He was an eternal skeptic. Right? He thought that all this legislation trying to help organize labor or trying to help workers was pointless, but he was going to uphold it as constitutional. But Brandeis was really a true believer who believed that the states and the federal government could pass pro-labor legislation that would make us more of an industrial democracy. And in that way, Brandeis's philosophy was a lot closer to Frankfurter's than Holmes's was. Frankfurter returns to the War Department during World War I. He's called back from Harvard Law School. He is engaged in a lot of really hot-button activities. He travels across the country on this commission that Wilson established, trying to stop strikes all over the nation that are going to impede the war effort. And Frankfurter writes this report about the deportation of immigrants who are working in copper mines. And it outrages his friend Theodore Roosevelt because it implicates some of Roosevelt's friends. And they don't part as friends. Frankfurter's very good at maintaining his friendship with Roosevelt. But Roosevelt describes the report that Frankfurter wrote as Bolsheviki in a letter that's printed in newspapers all over the country. And that letter really damages Frankfurter's career just about more than anything else. Because when anyone wants to attack Frankfurter as this kind of radical liberal, they cite Roosevelt's letter saying that he was a Bolshevik. So Frankfurter during this time argues a couple of cases in the Supreme Court. He takes them over from Brandeis, defending minimum wages and maximum hour laws. He succeeds despite the presence of Lochner versus New York on the books. In fact, some people thought that Frankfurter's victories in those cases kind of overruled, kind of sub silentio, kind of silently, overruled Lochner versus New York. But that proved to be incorrect. Where Frankfurter's Jewishness really comes back into play is in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference. So Frankfurter and Brandeis are both non-observant Jews, right? Frankfurter stopped going to synagogue when he was about 15 years old. He walked out of a high holiday service. He said, I don't believe in God. Going to high holiday services makes me a hypocrite, and he never went again. But unlike many other observant Jews of his time, both Frankfurter and Brandeis believed in Zionism. In fact, by about 1916, Brandeis is a de facto leader of the American Zionist movement, and he enlists Frankfurter to be his lieutenant. And in 1919, Frankfurter is supposed to be going back to Harvard Law School, but instead he heads to Paris as a member of the Zionist delegation to try to get the members of the peace conference to try to recognize Palestine as a Jewish state. Frankfurter knows every Zionist leader, both at home and abroad. On the left is one of the heroes who's on a stamp in Israel and is lauded all over Israel, a man named Aaron Aronson, who was a Jewish person whose family settled in Palestine, and he was an agronomist who learned how to grow wild wheat. And he also set up a secret spy network against the Turks who were occupying Palestine. He and Frankfurter were very close. They were both in Paris together. Frankfurter, the person on the right, is Prince Faisal. He was representing the Arabs in Palestine. And Frankfurter and Prince Faisal, with T.E. Lawrence of Arabia acting as a go-between, established a peace accord. And Faisal and Frankfurter basically realized their common enemy was the Turks, and that the Arabs and the Jews could create what they called one Palestine complete if they just worked together and got autonomy over Palestine. And Frankfurter thought that was in jeopardy. He was in Paris. He knew a lot of people in the different delegations. He knew Wilson was not at the top of his game in Paris. He had some written exchanges with the president, whom he knew well. And the president did not seem enthusiastic about negotiating a Jewish state in Palestine. So Brandeis called in the biggest gun that he knew, and that's Louis Brandeis. And he asked Justice Brandeis, he said, we need you. You need to go to Palestine on a fact-finding mission. You need to report back to the Paris Peace Conference on what you found. This was billed as a vacation because, of course, sitting Supreme Court justices are not supposed to be working on behalf of the Zionist movement and influencing the Paris peace talks. This photograph is really important because it's a picture of Brandeis in Palestine. I got this from Israel, and people thought that Louis Brandeis' appearance changed in Palestine, that it made him a changed man. If you look at this picture, he looks totally different than this one, right? Totally different, right? His hair is shorter. He looks, Frankfurter thought even his personality changed in Europe and Palestine, that he was, Louis Brandeis was a lot like Barack Obama in the following way. When you're the first at anything, he was very tightly controlled and composed and wound, and he was not someone you would want to have a beer with, right? Just to refer to George W. Bush. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. was just the opposite. He was a complete extrovert, and the young people at the House of Truth loved having dinner with him. But Brandeis was a bit of a cold fish around small groups of people, but not in Palestine and not in Paris in 1919. And despite those efforts of Brandeis in Palestine, of course, there was not a Jewish state that came out of the 1919 Paris peace talks, but Brandeis and Frankfurter didn't stop working, right? It sort of became their life's mission to create a Jewish state in Palestine. And Brandeis thought that Palestine could be a laboratory of democracy, right? He thought that Brandeis was, that Palestine could be the ultimate kind of liberal agrarian state that he sort of envisioned. But I'll get back to it, I promise, on Palestine. 4 years later, Frankfurter's back at Harvard Law School, and he's appearing his last time before the Supreme Court of the United States. And he's defending a minimum wage law for women and children in this city, in Washington, D.C. D.C. minimum wage law, he thinks he's going to win after he's won the cases in Oregon about the minimum wage and maximum hour laws. He thinks his strategy in the case is William Howard Taft is now the Chief Justice, and Frankfurter is his foremost critic in the pages of the New Republic. But Frankfurter says, if I can only get Taft's vote, I'm going to win. Well, he only got 2 votes. Brandeis was recused from the case. He got Taft's vote, and he got Holmes's and no one else's. And he lost, and he never argued another Supreme Court case again. And he thought after that case, Atkins versus Children's Hospital affirmed Lochner versus New York and established liberty of contract as the rule and not the exception. And Atkins flipped what lawyers would call the burden of proof, and he said it was on the burden of lawyers to prove a law's constitutionality rather than the other way around. Usually when you go into court and you have to try to show that a law is unconstitutional, the burden's on the challenger, but not so, says Atkins versus Children's Hospital. Frankfurter was so demoralized by this decision, he believed the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment should be written out of the Constitution, that it should be removed because it gave the justices of the Supreme Court of the United States too much power. And he saw the justices empowering themselves to strike down all sorts of economic legislation that they disagreed with. And he basically saw the New Deal constitutional crisis coming, right? A majority of conservative justices striking down laws because of political and economic opposition. And I'll get there. Frankfurter throws himself into political causes. And like the Goodman family, I'm really honored to be here on behalf of the Goodman family. Frankfurter would have been friends with the Goodmans. In hearing their story, I could tell that he would be friends with them because in Boston, he really threw himself in all sorts of social causes and political causes. When A. Mitchell Palmer, who was the Attorney General of the United States, began rounding up radical immigrants after World War I, Frankfurter was asked by a federal judge in Boston to represent 21 of them as a friend of the court. And Frankfurter and Zachariah Chafee, another Harvard law professor, got 17 of the 21 freed from deportation. And they called A. Mitchell Palmer a liar and offered to and wrote a report showing all the unconstitutional conduct that A. Mitchell Palmer had engaged in, and the Palmer raids were orchestrated by a young functionary in the Bureau of Investigation by the name of J. Edgar Hoover. And it was after that Frankfurter saw that Hoover was a complete menace. And he kept urging people, including Harlan Fiske Stone, when he became Attorney General in the 1920s, he said, you have to fire Hoover. And Stone didn't do it. But Hoover knew how evil he was from the Palmer raid. Frankfurter knew how evil Hoover was from the Palmer raids. But where he really gets in trouble in Boston is in this case of 2 anarchists who are tried and convicted of killing a paymaster of a shoe company north of Boston, robbing and murdering him. They're sentenced to death. Frankfurter wants nothing to do with the case, even though everybody's after him to opine about it. And finally, in around 1923, the prosecutor's witness, the ballistics expert for the prosecutor, admits in an affidavit that he misled the jury, that he knowingly misled the jury. And once Frankfurter sees that affidavit, he vows to read the whole record and to figure out what happened in the case. He reads the record, and he decides to write a real short book, which is still in print today, called The Case of Sacco and Vanzetti. So any person, non-lawyers and lawyers, could read this book and decide for themselves whether or not Sacco and Vanzetti had received a fair trial. The problem with the timing of the publication of the book in early 1927 was the case was still pending before Massachusetts' highest court. And people blamed Frankfurter for injecting himself into the case, for trying to influence the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, and Frankfurter became public enemy #1 in Boston, and really a pariah in Boston, for injecting himself in this controversy about Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti were executed in August of 1927, despite some last-minute pleas to Holmes and Brandeis and Harlan Fiske-Stone to stop the execution. But Frankfurter, after the Sacco and Vanzetti case, was forever tied by Hoover and others as a dangerous radical. He, during the same period, is not litigating in court. He's not trying to solve problems in the Supreme Court of the United States, but he's really involved in electoral politics. He's a big supporter of Bob La Follette's third-party candidacy for president in 1924. Walter Lippmann accused him of throwing away his vote by voting and campaigning for La Follette, and Frankfurter said, and this is pretty prescient, he said, I care about 1944. And not 1924. He was trying to grow a political party that was a liberal party. The Democratic Party in the 20s and the Republican Party in the 20s were both liberal and conservative. And in fact, the Democratic Party was far more conservative than the Republican Party because it was dominated by Southern Democrats. He also campaigns super hard, and this is a sort of bad picture of them, but of Frankfurter with Al Smith, who was the 1928 candidate for president and the first Catholic candidate for president of any major political party nominee. During the 1928 election, or afterwards, Walter Lippmann is in despair because Smith gets crushed by Herbert Hoover. And he says, it's over, the Democratic Party is over, and Frankfurter says, you're totally wrong. Because during that same election, in the gubernatorial race in New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who Frankfurter had worked with in the War Department during World War I, eked out a victory in New York, which was remarkable because New York even voted against Al Smith, who had been the former governor of New York. So Franklin Roosevelt ekes out this victory in New York, and his principal advisor as governor, outside advisor, is Felix Frankfurter. Frankfurter's advising him about labor policy, about criminal law, about public utilities, and hydroelectric power, all things that Frankfurter's teaching at Harvard Law School, and they become super close. Of course, 4 years later, Roosevelt becomes elected president of the United States, and Frankfurter becomes one of the most powerful people who's not in Washington. He turns down Roosevelt's offer to be the Solicitor General representing the United States government before the Supreme Court of the United States because he says to Roosevelt, I can be of more good for you from the outside, and indeed he is. He is a jack of all trades for Roosevelt. He sends scores of Harvard Law students into the New Deal to work in New Deal agencies, but he also is really advising for, Roosevelt about the rising war in Europe. As soon as Roosevelt gets inaugurated in 1933, Frankfurter takes off for London, and he becomes the Eastman Professor at Oxford, right outside of London. And so he's really hearing all of this news about the war, or about Hitler, and about the rise of Hitler and the rise of the fascist powers. He's in London all the time, which is why I say London. And he's, in the whole political scene in London, in the political scene in Oxford, and he writes a magazine article in a magazine called Today magazine in 1934, categorizing all of Hitler's atrocities in Europe. So he's wise to it as early as any major American political figure is, and he is advising Roosevelt on what to do about Hitler. I said he sent his top students. Those are two of his top students, Tom Corcoran and Ben Cohen. who, for those of you who know anything about securities law, they wrote the 1933 Securities Act, the 1934 Securities Act, and the 1935 Public Utilities Holding Company Act. They were so powerful that in 1938 they were on the cover of Time magazine. But all this time, Frankfurters advising Roosevelt about the war. The big domestic moment for them is really court packing, right? In 1937, this very conservative Supreme Court, using Lochner and other decisions, are striking down not only state economic legislation, but federal economic legislation as well, based on a very narrow conception of Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. And Roosevelt responds by threatening to pack the Supreme Court. He has a bill that he styles the Judicial Reform Bill, and it proposes to add an additional Supreme Court justice for everyone over the age of 70, and that would increase the size of the court from 9 to a maximum of 15. He leaves Frankfurter completely in the dark about the court packing plan. He says, I have a big surprise for you. He left everyone in the dark. Part of the reason why the court packing plan failed was because Roosevelt wanted to be like a magician and just say, aha, and here's the court packing plan. Well, people in Congress who he left in the dark really didn't like that. Even though it was an overwhelmingly Democratic Congress in both the House and the Senate, they were really ticked at him. But he told Frankfurter, he said, you're in for a surprise, just reserve judgment until we talk. So Frankfurter hears about the court packing plan like everyone else. He meets with Roosevelt. Roosevelt says, I need your help making the case against the conservative Supreme Court of the United States, but I'd like you to remain publicly neutral on the court packing plan. And Frankfurter does. A lot of people criticize him for not speaking out about the court packing plan, but Frankfurter's loyalty to Roosevelt really trumps his own personal beliefs about whether he thinks the court packing plan was a good idea, because he really did not think that the remedy, the court packing plan, was a good idea as a way of fighting a very conservative Supreme Court. And we can talk in the Q&A about whether court packing is a good idea. 2 years later, well, first of all, during the rise of the Nazis, Frankfurter is dedicated to getting scholars out of Europe. So he, along with the head of the New School and colleges and universities all over the country, are working to get Jewish scholars out of Europe, right, who are being kicked out of their universities. They're jobless and have nowhere to go. So Frankfurter is involved in getting all of them out. And one of the people he tries to get out is his Uncle Solomon. So in 1938, after the Anschluss in Austria, his Uncle Solomon, who's close to 80 years old at this time, has been thrown into a Nazi prison. And Frankfurter's standard story on how he got his uncle out of this Nazi prison, because he did get him out of a Nazi prison, was that he had written a letter to his friend in London, Lady Astor, who was the head of, who was American-born, but the head of the Cliveden set and also a Nazi sympathizer. She was friends with von Ribbentrop, and he says that he contacted Lady Astor. She contacted von Ribbentrop, and von Ribbentrop got the uncle out of the Nazi prison. I think it's true that he contacted Lady Astor, but I do not think it's true that she's the one responsible for getting his uncle out of the Nazi prison, because at the National Archives, I'd found some evidence that George Messersmith, who was in the State Department and stationed in the Austrian consulate, was the one who got the uncle out of the Nazi prison, and I was intent on figuring out how. And lo and behold, if you look hard enough at in the National Archives, which is not an easy place to navigate and which is under-resourced and underfunded and starved by Congress, but has a wealth of documents, I found this is a telegram from Secretary of State Cordell Hull asking George Messersmith on Frankfurter's behalf to check on the whereabouts of Frankfurter's uncle and to get him out of the prison. And there are many more documents like this. The uncle did get out of the prison, went back to his apartment in Austria where he was living under house arrest. The Nazis and the Austrian government expropriated the uncle's entire library in the apartment and took it for the University of Vienna and the Nazis, and they didn't give it back, and they didn't pay the family any reparations for the library in the 1970s when they tried to get reparations for it. The uncle probably could have gotten to this country if he wanted to. His children got out and lived the rest of their lives in this country, but I think the uncle considered himself an Austrian and wanted to die in Austria, and he died of natural causes in Austria, in his apartment, in his 80s. And Roosevelt didn't know a thing about it. Frankfurter was determined during this whole time not to rely on his friendship with Roosevelt to get his uncle out of the prison or get his uncle out of Austria. In fact, the first time that Roosevelt heard a thing about Frankfurter's uncle Solomon was when Solomon died in 1941 and saw his obituary in the New York Times. So when the war started, so Frankfurter gets nominated to the Supreme Court in 1939. His uncle sees that. This is a photograph in the Senate caucus room because Frankfurter is the first Supreme Court nominee ever to testify about his nomination. And the reason, I'll give you one, there's one small exception. Harlan Fiske-Stone, when he was Attorney General, briefly testified on a case that was in the Justice Department that he had green-lighted. But aside from that, Frankfurter was the first justice to have a sort of general open testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee. That room was packed with like 800 people and newsreels and flashbulbs and cameras like the one you see here. Frankfurter's former student is Dean Acheson, the future Secretary of State, is the one representing him at this hearing. There were a bunch of lunatics and anti-Semitic crazy people who were attacking Frankfurter at this hearing. This is a woman named Elizabeth Dilling. She spent her entire life hunting communists, and her testimony at the hearing unraveled when she accused several members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, as well as Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, of being communists. And so she ended up being laughed at, and Frankfurter ended up being confirmed, but not without a lot of nativist and anti-Semitic testimony, including by Senator Pat McCarran, who didn't even believe that Frankfurter was a naturalized American citizen, and they had to show proof of Frankfurter citizenship to get him through that hearing. And this is a cartoon in a Nazi newspaper of Frankfurter riding Roosevelt's back and basically showing that I can't read German. My research assistant could, but I cannot. But basically showing that Roosevelt was just a tool of the Jews or a friend of the Jews. In fact, the New Deal at this point is regarded as the Jew deal, right? Because so many of Frankfurter's former students are in the New Deal, and these conspiracy theorists believe that Frankfurter and this Jewish cabal were in charge of the New Deal, and so they blamed Frankfurter for all of the New Deal's failures up to that point. So Frankfurter joins the court, and one of the downsides of his career as a justice is he kept advising Franklin Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt's advisors while he was sitting on the Supreme Court. Today, that's a huge no-no, and nobody does that. But in the first half of the 20th century, there was a lot more of that being done. But I think it really impaired Frankfurter's judgment. It certainly took up a lot of his time, and it compromised him in cases such as the Japanese internment cases and the cases of the Nazi saboteurs, on which he should not have been sitting on because he was advising War Department officials, including Henry Stimson, who was back in the War Department at Frankfurter's urging. So he was really compromised. This is a picture, this is the only picture that I've ever found of Franklin Roosevelt and Felix Frankfurter in the same frame. And here he's swearing in Secretary of the Navy Knox. But during the war in the early 40s, Frankfurter becomes a super patriot. And some of it, and he really loses the label of a liberal while he's on the Supreme Court. People think that he's a liberal turned conservative justice. And one thing you have to understand is in 1940, he took in 3 children from Britain of a former student. They knew the Blitz was coming in London, and to save those children, they all came and lived with Felix and Marion, who were childless. And here's Frankfurter in Maine with the youngest of those 3 children, Oliver Gates. I had the great privilege of interviewing Oliver Gates and seeing all of his family's correspondence with the Frankfurters in the British countryside. Oliver unfortunately passed away of cancer earlier this year, but it was really an amazing thing to kind of reach out and touch history by meeting Oliver. But the lives of these three British children and their parents' lives, they were corresponding constantly, I think were always on Frankfurter's mind, and I think in many ways inform where he lost control of the court, and where he lost the label of liberal, which was in 1943, when he wrote a vitriolic dissent in a case called West Virginia versus Barnett, where the Supreme Court struck down the state of West Virginia's attempt to compel two daughters of Jehovah's Witnesses to salute the flag, and Frankfurter thought that the free speech and free exercise should not be used. West Virginia versus Barnett was a free speech case, should not be used to strike down laws of general applicability. And he said, he began his dissent, which was very personal. He said, as one of the most, as a member of one of the most despised minority groups in this country, I'm attuned to injustice, but states have to have the ability to be able to establish curricula and pass laws of general applicability. Liberals sort of jumped ship from him. They saw him as a judicial failure. But to me, Frankfurter was really doing what he learned in law school and what he learned from the Lochner case and what he learned from Thayer, which was the Supreme Court should not make social policy, particularly when the government is passing laws that are of general applicability and not targeting the Jehovah's Witnesses as Jehovah's Witnesses. The one area where I think Frankfurter really adapted judicial restraint for the better was to use the 14th Amendment to protect the rights of African Americans. That started in a 1944 case called Smith versus Allwright, which struck down the all-white primary in Texas. Frankfurter in 1948 hired the first African American Supreme Court clerk. On the left is William T. Coleman, who's Ford's future transportation secretary, and his co-clerk is Elliot Richardson, who was Nixon's attorney general during the Saturday Night Massacre, another great American, and they were best friends from Harvard Law School, but this was huge, right? It made national news, but people wrote all these letters to Frankfurter and said, and Frankfurter was like, even his messenger, his African American messenger, congratulated him on hiring Coleman. And he said, you should know, you of all people should know that I don't care what color skin William T. Coleman had. I hired him because he was first in his law school class, and the messenger replied to him. He said, Mr. Justice, we don't always get what's fair to us. And I think just having Coleman in chambers was huge for Frankfurter because the cases were making their way through the court to strike down racial segregation and state-sponsored racial segregation in public schools. Coleman wrote an incredible memo when he was Frankfurter's law clerk about two of the graduate school cases, one in Texas called Sweat v. Painter, right? Coleman wrote a real long memo to the justice about why and how the justice should decide those cases, and that really, I'll get to Israel in a second, but that really put Frankfurter on the path to Brown versus Board of Education. And I wrote a long chapter in the book about how Frankfurter and Hugo Black were instrumental in helping Earl Warren achieve unanimity in Brown versus Board of Education, which for you non-lawyers struck down separate but equal schools, public primary and secondary schools in this country. Warren was a new justice that term. He was a recess appointment. He was not confirmed until February or March of 1954. He had about 2 or 3 months as a confirmed justice to get a unanimous court, and he got huge help from Frankfurter. A huge moment before that is 1948. And I wrote a long chapter on this, but I think few people realize how instrumental Frankfurter also was to having the United States recognize Israel, be the first country to recognize Israel as a state. Frankfurter had 2 protégés working for Harry Truman on the left there. David Niles and Max Lowenthal were 2 of Harry Truman's closest advisors inside the White House, and they were pushing Truman very hard to have the U.S. recognize Israel. There were a ton of anti-Semites in the State Department, the same anti-Semites in the State Department that kept Jewish people from immigrating to this country during the Holocaust. We're arguing that we shouldn't disturb our relationship with Saudi Arabia and King Saud of Saudi Arabia. We shouldn't recognize the state of Israel, but Frankfurter's White House aides prevailed. On the right of Truman there is Chaim Weizmann. He came to the White House even though he was in ill health at the time. Chaim Weizmann and Frankfurter had been friends since 1917. The night before this White House visit, even though Weizmann's very sick, he meets with Frankfurter at Frankfurter's hotel room, and they celebrate this day. And a funny moment came when Chaim Weizmann gave Harry Truman a Torah, and Harry Truman goes, "Oh, a Torah! I've always wanted one." And Frankfurter's aides sort of laughed at that was Truman's reaction, that he had given him a Torah. Frankfurter, as I said, continued to support and use the 14th Amendment to protect the rights of African Americans, but he was really troubled by the turn the Warren Court took. And not the outcomes of its decisions as much as the way they were writing them. And what the Warren Court started to say was, we, the Supreme Court, are the last word on the Constitution, not the other elected branches. And Frankfurter really rejected that idea. In Cooper versus Aaron, which is the Little Rock school crisis case in 1958, where they really slapped down the Arkansas governor, Orville Faubus, the majority opinion says the federal judiciary is supreme in the exposition of the law of the Constitution, and Frankfurter wanted to come out the same way, but in a slightly different register. And he really pissed off all of his colleagues by writing a concurring opinion, trying to convince Southern lawyers that, hey, Orville Faubus should not go around violating federal court orders, not because we have the last word on the Constitution, but because it's the rule of law. And so he preferred to decide these cases on kind of rule of law grounds, that when a federal court issues an order, any elected official should follow it, not because the Supreme Court has the last word on the Constitution. As I said, he really opposed this idea of judicial supremacy. He was not against outlawing racial gerrymandering. He wrote a really influential opinion about the elders of Tuskegee, Alabama. White people decided to draw a 28-sided sea dragon. This is the picture here, excluding all but 4 or 5 black residents from the city of Tuskegee, so they couldn't vote in city elections. He struck that down in 1960, but he was unwilling to go along with the Supreme Court in Baker versus Carr, which was about the state of Tennessee's failure to reapportion their state legislative districts for 60 years. But if you notice what Justice Brennan, like in Cooper versus Aaron, says in Baker versus Carr, he says, the court is the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution. And Frankfurter and his colleague, Justice Harlan, they totally reject that conception of the Supreme Court of the United States. They just see the Supreme Court as one of 3 co-equal branches, and that the Supreme Court does not have a monopoly on wisdom in interpreting the Constitution. Frankfurter dissents in Baker versus Carr. He does not believe that the Supreme Court should get involved in what he describes as inherently political disputes. In fact, the reasoning of Baker versus Carr, the equal protection language in Baker versus Carr, is the exact reasoning the Supreme Court uses in another notorious case, which is in 2000 in Bush versus Gore, which was the Voldemort of constitutional case law until last week. Frankfurter's last case is Baker. He has a stroke shortly after Baker versus Carr. He tries to come back to the Supreme Court of the United States, but can't. He resigns in August of 1962, and he is replaced by Kennedy's labor secretary, Arthur Goldberg. Nonetheless, even though he's sort of wheelchair-bound, he's still meeting with American presidents, and that's Frankfurter in the center, meeting with John F. Kennedy in '62. He was very close to Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson. That's LBJ walking out of Frankfurter's funeral. From Frankfurter's apartment, you can see Dean Acheson right behind Lyndon Johnson in 1965. It's a pretty remarkable story to have somebody come to this country, age 11, not speaking a word of English, finishing first in his class at Harvard Law School, and knowing every American president from Theodore Roosevelt and LBJ, and making a major impact on not just our legal system in this country, but also our Jewish life in this country. And at that, I'll stop talking and take questions.
Brad, thank you so much, especially for those non-legal minds among us. Just for the way you capture not just the justice, but really the development in not just at the Supreme Court, but over the course of time, looking at the creation of this liberal establishment and the ability to argue with what we see happening, which one of the things that really struck me was the way in which Justice FRANKFURTER used social media of the time, newspapers, articles, et cetera, to really try to influence in a way that would have bearing on legal decisions and even, you know, populating the court, et cetera. It was amazing to see the way in which he did that, which I don't think we see that in the same way today.
That's a great insight. Let me explain one of the challenges of writing this book. FRANKFURTER wrote 10 to 15 letters a day. Those are scattered all over the country and the world. And this writing about FRANKFURTER broke a couple of prior judicial biographers, some of whom were quite esteemed. And this took me all over the country. It took me to England, Palestine, formerly Palestine, Israel. You know, he today, as you point out, Rabbi Schenkman, would have been on every social media outlet possible, right? Instead of writing 15 to 20 letters a day or 10 to 15 letters a day, he would have been on Twitter, he would have been on TikTok, he would have been on, you name the site, he would have been on there. He would have had his own paid newsletter, right? But at the time, he influenced people by writing these letters and by contributing articles to the New Republic as really the chief critic of the Supreme Court, when at a time there weren't a lot of people writing about the Supreme Court as an institution the way they are now all over the place. There was no Dahlia, he was Dahlia Lithwick, right, of Slate criticizing the court, but there weren't a lot of Dahlias, right? He was the only one, and today there are dozens of them, or not as well as she does, but there's still a lot of people doing it, and that made this project real challenging, but you're right, he really believed that the court deserved public criticism, and that it needed to be held accountable, whether through letters or through that century's version of social media. I'm sure there are questions. But only because I have the microphone, I'm going to get one more in. Do it. Which is, it's fascinating to me. Of course, I'm going to focus on the Jewish side of things. That he really distanced himself from organized religion and from Judaism, yet was so engaged in both his disappointment in Roosevelt's lack of action or inaction during World War II and prior to World War II, and then really was so engaged in Zionism and befriending Chaim Weizmann and certainly in getting Truman to come around. And so can you speak to that in terms of how that while not religious, having that really strong sense of Zionism and commitment to Zionism? Yeah, I mean, he was a cultural Jew in every sense of the word, right? He was, completely Jewish in the way he conducted his life. He just didn't believe in going to synagogue. The Roosevelt relationship is really complicated. He revered Roosevelt, right? Roosevelt was, it was sort of Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. in that kind of order, right? For FRANKFURTER's pantheon. But the Holocaust thing is really tricky. It was really tricky for me as a writer. It was really tricky for me as someone who lets the evidence decide how I'm going to write something. I don't know how these stories are going to come out. I just kind of sift through the evidence. Roosevelt is tricky because he was a sphinx. If you went into Roosevelt's office and you told him something, you would come out of his office believing that he agreed with you. And then the next person would come in his office with the opposite point of view, and that person would come out of his office thinking that that Roosevelt agreed with him as well, right, or her as well. And so, the other thing FRANKFURTER knew about Roosevelt was the way to get something done was not to confront him, right? He didn't like confrontation. He didn't like, he wasn't like a yeller or a screamer, so he couldn't like yell and scream at Roosevelt to help Jews in Europe during the Holocaust. So I think he made his case with Roosevelt, and then he realized when that case wasn't going to result in change in terms of letting more Jewish immigrants into this country, then he worked the people that he knew in the administration, and he worked he set up a meeting with Louis Brandeis and Secretary of State Cordell Hull, and tried to get Brandeis, while Brandeis was on the bench, to say, hey, tell all of your anti-Semites to quit it and to let all of these Jews into the country. Then Frankfurter himself met with Cordell Hull, and then in those days, the Labor Department was in charge of immigration, and Frances Perkins was the head of the Labor Department. And Frankfurter met directly with Frances Perkins and wrote her numerous letters to say, hey, relax the quotas on Jews, let them into this country. She claimed the quotas weren't an obstacle. The real obstacle during the Holocaust were just the multiplicity of anti-Semites in the State Department who were closing doors to the Jewish people. And let me just add one more wrinkle. There were a lot of Jewish people in this country who didn't want more Jewish people immigrating. And Frankfurter and Brandeis did not blame Roosevelt. They blamed German Jews who were very wealthy in New York. And I'll just name the type of folks. It's the Sulzberger crowd, right? The senior Morgenthau crowd. They didn't want more Eastern European Jews in this country, and they told Roosevelt they didn't want more Eastern European Jews in this country. And Roosevelt was conflicted about what to do because he had some Jews telling him to do one thing, and he had other Jews telling him to do the opposite. In fact, one of the most shocking things I learned in my book was when, before Frankfurter got nominated to the Supreme Court, Sulzberger, the head of the New York Times, back-channeled to Roosevelt that he did not want Felix Frankfurter on the court because he was worried about anti-Semitism and backlash with the rise of Nazism, and he was afraid that Frankfurter's nomination would stir up too much anti-Semitism in this country. That completely blew me away, and Frankfurter and Brandeis were outraged that Sulzberger and the Morgenthau's were engaged in that kind of campaign. So, it was really kind of complicated terrain. I don't think he resented Roosevelt, and he also didn't give Truman quite enough credit for kind of dismissing all of the anti-Semites in the State Department and following the advice of David Niles and Max Lowenthal. Roosevelt was a little less willing to buck the people in the State Department, and he tried to take the path of least resistance. In many ways, Truman was far more courageous on the issues of Israel and the Jews than Roosevelt ever was.
Thank you. So I see a few hands.
Brad, you talk about in 1919, Brandeis and Frankfurter attempted to do something. Is there any implication with the Balfour Declaration?
Well, the Balfour Declaration had already been established, so they thought that they had momentum. The Balfour Declaration gave the British a protectorate over Palestine, and the British basically made promises that were committed to a Jewish state. But by 1919, after the war, they had backed off. Were walking back from the Balfour Declaration, and Frankfurter knew that his friends in the British government were backtracking and were not as committed to a Jewish state in 1919, and it was because they wanted to protect the British Empire, right? They weren't going to dismantle other people's countries and empire, and because they were trying to protect their own. So he knew that he did not have the British as an ally in 1919, and he also knew that Wilson was faltering and not in good health, and didn't have a Jewish state even remotely at the top of his list, and couldn't even get the American portion interest in the treaty put in there in the way that he wanted to. Brandeis was the biggest gun he had, right? Because Brandeis was as respected by Wilson as any American political figure in this country. He had been an advisor to Wilson on antitrust matters. He thought that only Brandeis could save the day, and it just turned out I don't think anybody could have gotten a Jewish state in 1919, but Frankfurter was going to do his very best because he saw an opening at that moment in history. Thanks, Phil. Hi.
So this one's a little bit in the weeds for the normal people, but
okay, I knew I was going to get some law school questions.
the standard line on Frankfurter, which you sort of confirm, is that he became this apostle of judicial restraint. And in the early part of the century, when judicial restraint meant not overruling liberal laws, his natural political instincts would come through, and he would favor not overruling the liberal laws. And in the middle part of the century, when he's now a senior justice, when judicial restraint would mean not overriding conservative laws, he would in fact take the position of judicial restraint, thereby subordinating his political political instincts to the substantive outcome. And so that's kind of the line, and you're kind of nodding. But so the court today is very different than that. Justices seem to both liberal and conservative, left and right justices seem to line up on finding justifications for their political beliefs to put them into law. And my question for you is, can you think of anybody after Frankfurter, I'm trying to come up with Whizzer White, but I don't think it quite works, who took this line of subordinating his or her political views to an overarching, strongly held political philosophy like, Thayer's judicial restraint or Holmes's judicial restraint? Because you're a student of the Supreme Court, not just of Frankfurter.
At least I hope to be. That's my day job. So that's a great question, and so I've got two answers, right? The first answer: there's nobody who's kind of judicial restraint all the way down. On the current court. But what's really interesting is there are a lot of young academics who are much younger than I am, who have become Thayerians. One of them is Nico Bowie at Harvard Law School, who is Lonnie Guinier's son. And Lonnie Guinier was nominated for the Civil Rights Division, I think, in the Clinton administration, and was a prominent Harvard law professor. Samuel Moyn at Yale Law School is pretty darn Thayerian. There are others, but they're all these sort of 20, 30, 40-year-old left-leaning legal academics who are Thayerian all the way down, right? So there are people who have adopted the Frankfurter line. But to answer your question directly, I think there are two justices who exhibited a lot of similarities to Frankfurter. One is Justice Breyer. Justice Breyer was very fact-driven. He was often willing to go where the facts led him. He was also willing to compromise and was not so ideologically rigid. He comes out of the same kind of legal process tradition of Harvard Law School that Frankfurter taught in. And then the other one I would say is Elena Kagan. And the reason why I think Justice Kagan is similar to Justice Frankfurter is she's really guided by precedent. And Frankfurter's outrage about the flag salute cases was not just that people were using free speech and free exercise to overturn laws of general applicability, because the court had ruled on this issue a ton of times in the past, and it shouldn't change its mind. And he was very unwilling to overturn precedent. So I think that Kagan's following of precedent wherever it leads is similar to Frankfurter's. They're not on all fours with him, but I think they're in the Frankfurter tradition.
Justice Frankfurter was on the court for, about 23 years. And could you tell us a little bit, what was his relation? Well, I have two questions. One is, apparently, as you portray him, how much time did he spend in the Supreme Court doing the work? And the second thing is, what was his relationships with the other 8, very briefly, who were his friends and who were not?
Those are great questions. So I think during the war, the short answer is he didn't spend enough time on his work at the court. But I think you have to put yourself back in 1941 when Pearl Harbor gets bombed. Frankfurter realizes that the fate of civilization is in play, right? And we don't know how World War II is going to come out. Frankfurter did not know how World War II was going to come out, and the idea of Adolf Hitler ruling the world was not something that Frankfurter was willing to tangle with. And if he could help in fight the Nazis, he was going to do it any way he could. So he thought the ends justified the means in advising the Roosevelt administration, and particularly the War Department, on policy during that period. I still think in hindsight he spent too much time during those war years on advising the Roosevelt administration and not enough time on his day job. But for the rest of his time on the court, I thought he was pretty focused on being a justice. In terms of personalities, there were a lot of strong personalities when Frankfurter was on the court. He was very professorial. He was very pedantic at times. He was very strong-willed. He made a lot of enemies on the court. He hated William O. Douglas. They started out as friends, as New Dealers, and became sort of mortal enemies. The two worst people Frankfurter thought he had ever met were Joe Kennedy, who was spreading a lot of the anti-Semitic stuff about Frankfurter, creating the Jew deal, and the other one was Joe Kennedy's good friend, William O. Douglas. Those were the two worst people that Frankfurter thought that he had ever met. He had a complicated relationship with Hugo Black from Alabama, who was really a genius, but who was really Frankfurter's kind of ideological adversary in some, but not all the cases. And at times, I think Frankfurter took his legal disputes and personalized him, and that was a huge flaw. But he had a lot of friends on the court. He was very good friends with Robert Jackson, who's one of the great justices ever to sit on the court. And I think had Jackson not died of a heart attack in the fall of 1948, fall of 54, that Frankfurter would have had a colleague for years that would have been not only a great ally for him, but also sort of a tempering impulse against some of his worst instincts. John Marshall Harlan, who succeeded Jackson, was a really good friend of Frankfurter's, but so were a lot of people who aren't on everybody's radar screen today and who aren't really well known. Harold Burton, who was a senator from Ohio. Frankfurter greatly admired Harold Burton, even though he wasn't the biggest intellect ever to sit on the court. He was very good friends with Owen Roberts, who was the justice who switched after the court packing plan to start upholding Roosevelt's New Deal programs. They were very close. So this idea that Frankfurter alienated all of his colleagues for being pedantic, professorial, and mean, I think is a little overblown. He had friends and he had enemies on the court, and you know, did he personalize his disputes too often? Yes, but he definitely had allies when he was on the bench.
Thank you. As a non-lawyer, you spoke about him having influenced the presidents from Theodore Roosevelt to Lyndon Johnson. What was his relationship with the more Republicans, with Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, and Eisenhower?
So I said most, right? So he thought Harding was a buffoon, and he didn't want anything to do with Coolidge either. During that time, he was sending a lot of students into the Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover administrations, but he knew Herbert Hoover very well. And he knew Hoover from the House of Truth during World War I. They really admired Hoover's expertise. Hoover was feeding all of Europe. He started out by feeding the people of Belgium during World War I, and then he extended activities to all of Europe. And they sort of, both Frankfurter and Walter Lippmann saw, I'm going to use a word that they would not have used then, they sort of saw Hoover as the ultimate technocrat, right, as somebody who was really able to use expertise and science to solve problems. And so he initially had a lot of admiration for Hoover. He became less enamored of Hoover when he became Harding and Coolidge's Secretary of Commerce. He blamed Hoover for silence during those administrations on economic activities and sort of anti-labor activities. But still, even when Hoover became president, Frankfurter felt comfortable lobbying Hoover about Supreme Court nominees, and Frankfurter was instrumental in getting Benjamin Cardozo appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States to replace Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. And for those of you who don't know, Benjamin Cardozo was a Sephardic Jew and the second Jewish justice on the Supreme Court. With Eisenhower, he was not an Eisenhower fan, right? But yet, he and Learned Hand were unhesitatingly working with Herbert Brownell, who was Eisenhower's Attorney General, in getting the judicial nominees that they wanted on the Supreme Court of the United States, such as Charlie Wazansky's, well, that was FDR, but there were Henry Friendly on the Second Circuit. They lobbied Herbert Brownell and Eisenhower quite hard to get Henry Friendly, who was Frankfurter's best former student ever at Harvard, had the highest grade point average at Harvard Law School since Louis Brandeis, on to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. Henry Friendly, also Jewish, by the way.
I want to thank the gentleman over here for breaking the ice for the attorneys. But
Okay, I wasn't trying to demean the attorneys. I was trying to make everyone else feel normal, which they are.
there's an indication that he had to, I guess, push a number of the justices on the court in 1954 and possibly in 55 too, and Brown too, to get a unanimous decision. And something you said a little bit ago may have indicated to me who one of those persons might have been. But I was curious, which justices did he really have to push to come around to have a unanimous decision? I originally thought maybe Black was one of them, having come from Alabama. And you grow up in a situation like that, some of it sticks to you even though you don't want it to. So I'm wondering who those folks were.
So there were 3 Southerners on the court at the time, right? There was Hugo Black of Alabama, Tom Clark of Texas, and Stanley Reed of Kentucky. Fred Vinson had been the Chief Justice during the first term in which Brown was argued, but Fred Vinson died of a heart attack, and Frankfurter said, in kind of a nice, not so nice moment, he said, I'm saying this in synagogue, forgive me. He said, this is the first evidence I've ever seen that there is a God, when Fred Vinson passed away. And that wasn't nice. He said it privately, but he believed that Fred Vinson was not up to the task of most of his colleagues, left, right, and center, didn't respect him as Chief Justice, and he didn't think Fred Vinson was up to the task of leading the court to an opinion of any kind in Brown versus Board of Education. So Warren replacing Fred Vinson, a Kentuckian, was huge. To directly answer your question, Robert Jackson was on the fence. He was looking for a reason, even though he's from Western New York, he was looking for the right legal reasoning in which to overrule Plessy versus Ferguson or to kind of depart with the racially separate but equal rule in Plessy versus Ferguson. He wanted a legal rationale and not a political one. But the real sticking point was the other Kentuckian besides Vinson, Stanley Reed. And the neat thing was Reed's law clerk put a bunch of papers, deposited them at the Supreme Court of the United States. Jack Fassett, he worked on the Brown case, and I was able to hold in my own hands Reed's attempt to write a handwritten dissent in Brown versus Board of Education. So really Stanley Reed, I think, was the holdout in terms of outcome. But I think all the justices were kind of wondering, hey, how is this going to write? You know, and you know, getting them to agree on what it said, I think was hard. I just want to point out, my friend at Yale Law School, Justin Driver, thinks that the desire for unanimity was a huge mistake, right? That by trying to get a unanimous opinion, you got this kind of watered down decision that said, oh, separate but equal in public education has no place. That's what Brown says. It doesn't overrule Plessy. It just says separate but equal public education has no place. And Justin would have liked a stronger rule, you know, in favor of the rights of African Americans under the 14th Amendment, a stronger statement on the meaning of the 14th Amendment. And that's all well and good, and I think he's right. But at the time, the court wanted to speak in one voice because, as you know, 2 years later, in the Southern Manifesto, you had all the Southern members of Congress, save 3 or 4, who wrote this bill of particulars against Brown, attacking it on legal grounds. And it was a good attack, and it was you know, a well-reasoned attack. And so I think the court speaking in one voice was pretty important.
Brad, I want to thank you, and I want to just encourage everyone. Again, we have an opportunity if you would like to purchase the book and have it signed. We're going to do that in just a few moments. And I want to thank you for the book itself, especially as a non-lawyer, but really taking us through the historical developments in this country, not just through the court, but everything else that was happening around it. And it would be fascinating to hear Justice Frankfurter's opinion of what we see going on today. I don't know if you want to comment on that. Anybody? Anybody want to know that? What do you think he would say before we head out? And also curious if you're working on a next book.
Well, first on what he would say today, I think you're referring to the Dobbs case, overturning Roe versus Wade. And, you know, as I said to the earlier question, like, I think Frankfurter never would have overturned a 50-year-old precedent, right? I think he would have been guided by his belief that one way to check the court's power is to follow precedent, and certainly the court shouldn't reverse course without a really good reason, that Brown was the exception rather than the reason and I think he would have been outraged by the arguments last week before the court about the idea of the Supreme Court of the United States interfering with the state Supreme Court's interpretation of a state constitution over election law. This was the political thicket that Frankfurter warned people against. That those words, political thicket, appear directly in one of Frankfurter's opinions, and in his dissent in Baker versus Carr, he says, this is why we don't want the Supreme Court meddling with the electoral process. I think he would have been equally outraged by the decisions eviscerating the Voting Rights Act, such as Shelby County versus Holder in 2013 that gutted Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. He thinks the court would have had no business doing this kind of thing. And this was the kind of all-powerful Supreme Court that was overturning precedents in kind of willy-nilly fashion, that he was warning Earl Warren and William Brennan and his liberal colleagues. I think he'd be saying, I told you so. So there was another part of that question.
Well, it wasn't. It was a sort of a separate question. Are you working on your next?
I'm working on a short book. I know that one's like a yoga block, but I'm working on like a 9 or 10 chapter book about a black communist who'd been convicted of attempting to incite insurrection in Atlanta in 1933, and it was a capital crime. He was given mercy, 18 to 20 years on a Georgia chain gang. His name is Angelo Herndon, and a bunch of very prominent people got involved in trying to save him, and his case goes up twice to the Supreme Court of the United States. And in 1937, Owen Roberts, who I attempt to rehabilitate in my next book, writes this 5-4 majority opinion a few weeks after the switch in time, upholding or striking down Angelo Herndon's conviction on free speech and assembly grounds, and basically creating what I call a right to protest.
Great. Also very timely. Yes. Thank you. I want to thank Brad for being with us today. I also want to... We are always happy to welcome you back home to Washington Hebrew Congregation, and we hope that even though on Capitol Hill you have a home, that you know that this is your home away from home, and we hope you'll come back and join us often. I also want to thank the Goodman family for supporting today's lecture. And I also want to thank Brad's mom, Linda Snyder, and Aunt Nancy Van Grack for coming back and joining us. We're so happy to have you here. We're going to see them again in February at our Florida concert on February 13th for any who are down there or plan to be down there. But we hope to see all of you this coming Friday evening for Shabbat Hanukkah. It's a pre-Hanukkah celebration. Lots going on. I can tell you more about it when we greet you out in the atrium, but we hope you'll join us then. And as well, our next Amram Scholar Series is on January 8th. Graciela Makovsky, I'm going to get the name pronunciation correct by the time she's here. She'll be speaking on Latin American Jewish connections, both to Israel and generally speaking. We can talk more about that. You'll see more about that. I believe we also are going to be having a brunch that day as well with our president, Lou Wiener. So we hope you'll just mark that on the calendar. Lots of other exciting opportunities coming up as well. But thank you for being here, both those in our small chapel and those of you joining us on the live stream, in particular Joan Churchill. And we want to thank again Joan and Lois Ontel and Maury Goodman for all of their support in today's lecture. Thank you, everyone.